Welcome back to Asian Provocation. I'm your host, Ayoto Ataraxia. Back in Season 1, Episode 7, I interviewed Andrew Kong, who went to photograph the Mississippi Delta and the Chinese community that was there. He questioned the idea of an all-American ideal, challenging the Eurocentric background of the people in the United States. Today, our guest is another American from Dallas, Texas, currently living in New York City.
Hello?
Hello? Hey, Kevin.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Hello. We had this conversation over the cloud, over the Atlantic Ocean.
And you can hear me perfectly fine?
Yeah. Do you hear me okay?
Okay, perfect. I have the audio recording all set up here. Yes. Should I start pressing record now?
Andrew questioned the idea of the all-American. I thought about my own upbringing, my family, my community that are in Brisbane, Australia, which is in the state of Queensland. Queensland always reminds me of a mixture of Texas and California.
So my name is Kevin Chung.
Kevin's family, who's been in Texas for around 40 years, also grew up in a community of Koreans in Dallas. I asked him about their story. What was it like? What was the narrative in which people understood themselves in a place so far from Asia? I wanted to know if he spoke to his parents about their story.
Not really. Maybe I just didn't ask the right questions. It was never something that we brought up. Maybe from their end, they thought they didn't want to stir up old emotions or sorry, not old emotions, but painful emotions my dad, he moved to Texas actually when he was like a little kid, I think around 9 or 10. So he grew up in Texas speaking perfect English. And now he's like very fluent in like Korean and English, and he's kind of got like a Western twang to his Korean. And my mom actually met my dad on a business trip in Korea, and then he brought her over when she was like 23. And at the time she was studying mathematics at a university.
Our family came from different parts of the world, yet there were many parallels in our story of migration. I wanted to know how much of our experiences were similar and where did it differ? Did he have to go to an Asian school on the weekend to learn our own culture and language? How much was that separate from his weekday reality? Did you grow up speaking Korean and did you learn Korean with them or go to Korean school at all?
I did, yeah. I have very distinct memories of going to Korean school every Sunday and cramming homework in on top of school homework. So it was a very trying time for a 9-year-old. Logistically, I mean, it is a lot of work having to, memorize letters and a whole nother vocabulary and alphabet on top of the demanding schoolwork that I had to do. I've always wondered why I was putting in more effort to learn my culture as opposed to other students. I grew up in a pretty diverse neighborhood and, went to a very diverse school. White kids were still like the majority, but it was definitely more diverse as I remember it. And I also grew up going to a Korean church. So I had that group of people that I was hanging out with as well. So that was fully Korean. It was very interesting going to church and hanging out with all the Korean kids and then going back to school and then hanging out with like a diverse melting pot of kids and their cultures.
It's no accident that so much of the Asian community do not speak of the past. Many wish to migrate out in search of a new opportunity and to try and bury the old horrors and memories. One such event was the Korean War, and like many of the wars of the 20th century, is part of the inevitable and ever-increasing conflict between the United States and the People's Republic of China. Since then, there's been a steady increase of population of Koreans in Texas, which composed of 3 groups. War brides from returning US troops, entrepreneurs who immigrated and started with very little capital, running moms and pops businesses such as gas stations, convenience stores, liquor stores, fast food restaurants, and general ethnic grocery stores. All of these were possible as they required little knowledge of English. Another sector were the professional Koreans who came as students and remained after graduation. Unlike other Asians, except Filipinos, vast majority of Koreans arriving in the United States were already Protestant Christians. These churches were a keystone in the community for assisting new arrivals and to help the community in dealing with the new world. As the current generation of Asian emigres, do we continue to serve these multiple communities living in a multicultural ideal, or do we tend to return to communities where we're understood?
I think before the pandemic, I really saw myself hanging out with different kinds of people of different socioeconomic backgrounds, careers. I wouldn't say that I'm like a social climber at all, but I think definitely working in fashion. And I've had to play the game and I've had to hang out reluctantly with people that I didn't necessarily want to associate with. But yeah, I think before the pandemic, I saw myself hanging out with different people. I had like a circle of friends in fashion. I had friends in the queer community. I have Asian friends that I hung out with. And then I had like a whole bunch of white friends that I hung out with. And there were different groups. And sometimes I would do my best, like on my birthday, to merge all spheres of my friends. And it would be kind of awkward. Now I think I'm trying to lessen the circle, decrease the size, and bring it all in, keep it simple. Pandemic has really affected the fashion industry in the sense that you can only do so much if you're only caring about your image, if you only care about like the surface. And that's what the fashion industry is based off of. It's based off of what you look like and how you look in clothes and personality as well. But given the pandemic and these restrictions, there aren't any more shoots happening. I mean, there are still shoots happening, but it's very limited. There aren't really that many events going on. So I feel like everyone's sort of cooped up in their homes now, trying to figure out what the next step is and just how to like market yourself. It's definitely difficult. I mean, not only just, I guess, income for everyone, there's definitely a decrease in jobs and decrease in opportunities. Feel like everyone's been fighting for the same jobs. If there is a job that pops up, everyone's fighting for it.
When you mentioned social climbing, the effects of it and like the different levels of need in which people need to do that or have more tendency or less tendencies, what does social climbing mean for you? And do you feel like you've had some different perspectives or like shifts in your own experiences and attitudes and realizations in your whole experience in New York City and also within fashion, the work itself?
Of course. For me, I don't really see myself as the kind of person to really put myself out there. I sort of like stand on the side and watch other people do it, and then I join in when the time is right. I feel like the term social climbing for me is kind of going against my personality. But I also think there's something to be said about people who do social climb, who climb these ladders and really put themselves on the line, really like hype themselves up and like show themselves out. And I give them credit. That's definitely a skill. That's something I've had to work on to really showcase my work and, show what I can do and what I can offer to society and to the company that I work for. When I think of social climbing, I think of parties and I think of events and influencers and models and everyone just trying to shine. There's so much competition and it's so saturated, especially in New York and especially in the fashion industry, that everyone's trying to hobble over each other, trying to outshine their closest friends. It's kind of a ruthless industry. I've worked at agencies and we book and secure models that shine the brightest because they're the ones that are going to bring in the income. And for me personally, I think, this can now go into a different topic of just getting tired of the same processes of, it's honestly capitalism if you think about it. It's really just that. I blame capitalism for everyone trying to climb over each other. I honestly don't know the solution to it because the world revolves around capitalism and especially fashion.
And right now you have your own agency.
Right.
And you're also working on increasing diversity and different visions of people. What is behind that thought for you, and like how do you manage that on a day-to-day basis?
I worked at several agencies in the past, and I also found out the ways that I don't want to run an agency and don't want to manage people that I don't really believe in. That's why I started my own agency, is because I wanted to represent and manage people that I thought that could really impact the world in a positive way.
That's an interesting one, like how to not run an agency. Like what are some of the things to not do?
Well, obviously finances, payment schedules, there's all these different fees that talent get charged. It's weird because typically in modeling industries, once you get signed, you're already in debt to the company that you're signed with because of all these different fees. I don't do those fees. I just don't believe that models should be in debt the second they sign with someone. Also, diversity. That's something that I don't really see a lot of agencies doing in the past, which is why I decided to leave.
Was it a difficult thing for you to do?
It was so difficult. I was nervous. I was scared. It was taking a huge leap.
What were you afraid of?
I was afraid of not being busy, and failure was my fear of failure. I was working at agencies and I was getting these benefits, I was getting salary, but it was definitely not worth my mental health. Also, the more I work for myself, I realize that I don't really take direction well from other people. Maybe I'm too opinionated, but I'm also a very creative person. And I guess for me personally, there's a certain way that I want things to be done or presented. Sometimes I don't have a say at these companies, and it really just goes against what I align with. Now it's going into my third year of my own business, and despite the pandemic, I've really seen an increase not only in profits, but also in value in terms of the kinds of talent that I have and that have chosen me as their manager, the different varieties of clients that have reached out wanting to work with the talent that I have. It's really affirming, and it makes me want to push even harder.
During the week prior to our interview, I was communicating with Kevin via Instagram. During that same week was the massive surge in anti-Asian hate crime.
A wave of violent, unprovoked attacks against Asian Americans consuming the city of New York. A 56-year-old man in Manhattan this week pummeled for no apparent reason. A man riding the subway sliced across his face from cheek to cheek. A woman viciously shoved in Queens. A 71-year-old woman punched in her face in Chinatown. A 36-year-old man stabbed in the back, now fighting to stay alive.
This is not a joke. I have seen this DA put people and street vendors in jail for both stuff, but now when the Asian gets attacked for no good reasons, he decided not to prosecute.
Attack to one, attack to all. Community leaders simmering mad this week on the Manhattan DA's doorstep after he dropped the second-degree attempted murder as a hate crime charge just a day after it was filed, saying there was no evidence the suspect saw his victim's face because he was wearing a mask and hat.
This should have been kept a hate crime. I can't fathom why within one day that changed.
ABC News analyst and former NYPD chief of detectives Bob Boy says any unprovoked attack, absent any other apparent motive, he would charge as a hate crime. A spokesperson for the Manhattan DA in a statement says the defendant's statement that he didn't like the way the victim looked at him does not establish a hate crime when the evidence to date shows that he ran up to the victim from behind and may have never actually seen his face.
Hate crimes are the only crimes that require proof of motive, and we don't have a machine that allows us to read people's minds.
Dr. Phyllis Gerstenfeld is a criminal justice professor at California State University. She says it's incredibly difficult to prove that motive beyond a reasonable doubt to reach a conviction. According to the most recent statistics tracked by Syracuse University, in 2019 through June of that year, of the 99 federal hate crimes charges, only 17 have been prosecuted. The handling of the stabbing in Chinatown isn't the first attack that enraged the community. Last July, an 89-year-old grandmother in Brooklyn was lit on fire. In that attack, and in so many others, at the outset of the investigations, police said no racial slurs were hurled, so hate crime charges were ruled out. As a result of that fury, the NYPD created the Asian Hate Crimes Task Force. Yet, even just last month, after the 71-year-old was slugged in her face on the subway, police said because no words were exchanged, it was not racially motivated. But why weren't cops investigating at least the possibility? We sat down one-on-one with the commanding officer of the task force, who set the record straight.
I think the department doesn't express what we do correctly. Just because we don't have the evidence yet does not mean we're not investigating as a hate crime. Historically, Asian Americans have been victims at a disproportionate rate in New York City. And the service they get from the police department, they don't really look for it, because they don't speak English, they're afraid of the police, there's cultural barriers and differences. Crimes go underreported for the Asian Americans because they don't want to come forward.
Kevin was very active in the spreading of awareness of the explosion that was happening in the United States. However, I noticed one day that Kevin's account had disappeared.
To be honest, I was exhausted. I spoke out a lot about racism last year, especially once the pandemic hit, and definitely a lot more during the whole Black Lives Matter movement and back in the summer. I think I've definitely hit breaking point where I need to remove myself just for a little bit. I also take little social media breaks every other month, and I totally delete the app. I deactivate my account. Sometimes I'll just, like in this case, I'll leave my business page open so I still get inquiries. But other than that, I'm not actively doom scrolling on Instagram for hours, just soaking in information that I don't need. And yeah, I might miss out on some news or some information, but I'll doom scroll again next month. And I think it's great though, honestly. Like, I think that it's our turn to speak out and speak up. We've never had a moment like this where Asian people felt like they could say something. And it is Black History Month too. And I know that we're all aware of that. So I think sometimes a lot of people are like, well, how do I say something? It's Black History Month. How do we speak about the injustices that are going on in the Asian community? I'm like, we're humans. You should just speak up on things that are wrong in the first place. Doesn't matter when.
As if there's limited quota.
It's like, oh, like it's Black History Month. I'm not gonna protect Asian people that are getting hurt.
Mm-hmm.
No, if you are a cognizant human being, then it doesn't matter what month it is. You bring up injustice anytime and call it out how it is.
Have you ever experienced personally racism or any situations that people would deny your experience?
I've definitely experienced microaggressions all throughout my life. Sometimes very direct racist remarks, sometimes even very potentially life-threatening moments. It's definitely happened in the workplace. It's definitely happened at the mall or in the subway or walking home from work or from the subway. It just doesn't really matter, but it'll like surprise you sometimes. But things like this still happen.
With the current series of anti-Asian hate crimes and slowly the increase in awareness and discussion in society, do you think it's just a trend, the flavor of the month, or do you have hope that we're building towards a shift in the larger understanding?
Isn't that like the biggest question ever? I think that everyone is asking the same thing. I definitely think it's a trend. Fashion agencies and companies and clients just jumped on this racial trend as well. Let's just see if they continue to push for inclusivity and diversity, because that's how it should be. It should just be inherent. It shouldn't be like, oh, we need a Black person. Oh, we need an Asian person. Oh, we need a queer person. It should just be, they should just have, them all. I mean, I definitely think we have a long way to go. Sorry, I have like pipes clinking in the back.
Oh, it's all part of the charm.
We love New York apartments.
Mm-hmm.
Even I ask myself that too. Is this a trend? I mean, I've all of a sudden seen modeling agencies like start taking on all of these curvier girls, like talent with unique quote unquote ethnic features. I mean, I think it's great that they're signing all these people of color, but I guess time will only tell. For me, when I see these things online, I do think that it is performative. But also, like, I want to give them the benefit of the doubt, like they're actually doing the work too. So I just kind of shut up and I just watch and I just see and take notes, because that's all you can really do. Like, I don't want to be that person that's like criticizing them on their every move, because we're on different levels, like on our journey. And I don't want to be the one like critiquing them on every step of the way. Like, oh, you're doing this wrong. This is performative. This is like optics. So me as a person of color, I'm watching this happen and seeing that it is like a trend. I just kind of zip my mouth and I just let things unfold. And sometimes I'm pleasantly surprised. I think for me, I had a really big perspective shift. Instead of focusing on how white people are going to do better, like how all these intrinsic white companies are going to do better, instead of focusing on that, I've been focusing on how diversity can be celebrated and how people of color can be uplifted, really pushing for representation by uplifting BIPOC stories and really just getting to know these people. And through that, diversity will be inherent. It's a perspective shift. It's not about, oh, what can we do? How can we tick off check marks? How can we fill the diversity resume? Instead of that, talk to and incorporate BIPOC in your everyday life. It shouldn't just be like a checklist, which I'm saying it again. A lot of companies are doing that. Like it's some sort of quota to fill.
Definitely. It rubs me a lot in the wrong way with all these things. And one of the biggest pains this year has been just the silence that is very loud. It's deafening.
It is.
There's always going to be people that don't understand, and these people I don't know, and I'm not naive. I wasn't born yesterday. But my own pain is the realization with some of the people that I know that I would have called friends, or people that I thought would have been more supportive or more understanding.
Right.
That has been the most painful thing for me, to be honest, even more than the people that attacks or personal attacks or, physical harm or emotional harm from very abrasive people. It's the silence. But did you experience any of these kind of feelings and situations?
Oh, 100%. I feel you. I can agree with you there completely. I feel like a lot of my so-called friends have been really silent about all the attacks and hate crimes against the Asian community. It just makes me think that, first of all, they are either completely unaware of what's going on, or B, they just don't know how to say it or how to speak up, which both are wrong. Or even reaching out to see how I'm doing is the least. It really surprised me that a lot of my friends didn't check in on me or really care to share anything. If it literally just takes one click of a button on your phone to share a story, the bare minimum. I was really upset. I felt so much rage. I was sad at first, but then I just felt really angry because all of my friends, and I'm not saying all of my friends, okay, these are just some people, and I'm saying this in general. In general, I think that people, when it came to George Floyd and Black Lives Matter, I think that really shook the nation, and it really just it shook everybody to the core. And when that happened, we wanted to share, we wanted to spread awareness, highlight all the injustices that have been going on. But when it came to the injustices of Asian people, they did not know how to respond, or if at all. And it really just made me mad. I felt so much rage. I even had to text people. Do you know what's going on? Are you aware of these attacks in California? And not just in California, but all over the country? Surely you're not, I see you, that you're active online. So, and I know that you're seeing my stories and you're seeing, the content that I'm posting regarding these hate crimes, yet you are not reacting to it. So yeah, I definitely felt betrayed and sad and mad. I still feel that way. I mean, I'm still learning to, I don't want to gaslight myself and say oh, well, everyone's on their own journey to their wokeness. So I'm just going to back off for a second. No, I'm going to, if they are my friends, I'm going to hit them up and be like, yo, why didn't you share anything about what's going on? You have seen my stories. Why didn't you text me? Why didn't you call me to see if I was okay? Because I'm not. And I think silence, apathy, passiveness, it's the biggest killer.
Absolutely. I find it's so violent. Apathy, ambivalence.
I had to text my friend, and the same guy that I talked to you about earlier, he was like, oh, I didn't know that was going on. Where can I find resources on what's going on? I'm like, have you seen the news? Where can I find resources? I've been posting about it the past week, and you've been seeing all my stories. There's Google, there's CNN, come on. There's Twitter, you're on Twitter all the time, reposting memes. Surely you are aware of all of this current events. So it really did infuriate me.
There's a violence that comes with the inability for society to accept different types of emotions. One of the emotions is anger. There's something to be said about the frustration of the other, of the oppressed, of the radicalized, of the racialized. There's a violence that comes upon oppression that we're expected to keep all that frustration in, to still find a way to exist and function as if nothing happened.
Right.
With Black Lives Matter, it was interesting to see what kind of evidence was needed in order for people to start listening, to attend to the injustices. I saw you last week that you posted, "I'm not your fetish." I really could relate to that. I am not your model minority. We are not just your oriental fantasy to fulfill part of your imagination. I'm a human being. I deserve to exist. I deserve to be understood, to be related to, and to be loved.
I feel you. I think this is a bigger conversation that needs to be held. And, there's so many layers to racism. One of that is being of fetishization of Asian people. And it goes back to the topic of fetishizing gay men. gay Asian men, that's a part of my identity as well. Like I'm living like three different identities. I'm living like the gay identity, the Asian identity, the American identity. It's really difficult. I like don't know where to place myself, and I'm still figuring that out till this very moment. But yeah, I think this conversation of fetish and fantasy needs to be held, because I'm sick and tired of being someone's fantasy. I didn't give you permission. Okay, I didn't give you consent. I am not your anime.
What is an example? Can you give one of what it feels like to be fetishized?
For me, it feels very dehumanizing. It feels very like I'm an object, or an object of pleasure for someone else, but I didn't ask for it. I didn't ask to be that object. Yeah, it just feels like I'm being used and not getting anything back, any sort of love or real attention or validation. It definitely sucks. Having to navigate that within the queer community, it's been tough. Maybe that's why I've been single for 9 years. Oh man.
Yeah, for me, I just got to a point where I was no longer willing to, or maybe I was no longer capable of having and splitting these different worlds. And I stopped performing or like adjusting myself for each new setting.
Right.
Between
I feel you.
Whatever, like corporate or queer or Asian, or there's so many languages that I speak, and I don't even just mean language from a linguistic sense, but even from a spiritual sense. There are so many different personas that I hold, and I know how to perform, and they're all part of me. I see how some of the structures are more non-accepting of others, be it a different culture or a different race, or just a different mindset or a different social class.
I agree with you. I feel like my life has been an entire performance. I've not only from like a musical standpoint, because that's what I studied, but just in different settings and environments, I've always had to perform to be liked, to be validated, to be seen a certain way, to appear more than what I am. And sometimes it's been in my favor and I got what I wanted. And other times it was an uphill battle to exist. For example, when I'm out pre-pandemic, I'm at a bar or, at a club. I always hung out with a very diverse group of people, but then we would go to predominantly white bars or white parties. And I always felt like a bystander just watching the party happening and observing. When I was first in New York, I really wanted to be a part of the scene, really wanted to jump in and meet new people. But every time I was there, I always got dismissed. Like I wasn't there. I was like a ghost. No one noticed me. I guess I realized that I had to perform. I had to really be outspoken to really get myself into the scene. So then I started not being myself. I started to overdo the jokes. I started to dress a certain way to appeal to the masses. I came up with internal strategies to one up the person next to me somehow, so that I can be liked and noticed in these queer, predominantly white communities. And it's sad. It's really sad that I have to do that. Whereas all these other people are just simply being themselves, and they are liked for who they are. But I know it wasn't just me. At a party or something like that, it would just, I see myself there, and then I look around the room and there's a couple other people of color just sitting there watching it all unfold. So I know I wasn't alone. But I guess that was the first couple of years of New York. Now I'm just sort of over it. I don't really give a fuck anymore. I just go, and I go with my friends and have fun, really enjoy their company. I could care less about what people think. And I don't know if that's the New York nature or just the nature of getting older, but I just don't have the energy anymore to fake it. And if that means me being single forever, then so be it. At least I'm authentic to myself, and I'm not stuck in this cycle of trying to be liked.
Today on a walk, I thought about the concept and the issues about validation, right? And in this current world, it seems that there are certain people that are more starved for validation than others.
Right.
I realized that depending on where I am or what situation, there are different needs. I realized even with my sex life that it depends on so many environmental factors, and looking at also microaggressions and systemic frustrations. All these things kind of adds up. For example, when I lived in Asia, I needed less validation. And I've been living in Germany for 3 years. It's also a different feeling to be in New York, but I get the sense that I even want to get laid, not because I want to get laid, not because I want to experience pleasure or exchange. Sometimes I just want to feel validated because I feel on a day-to-day basis, I feel like completely not seen. I don't feel...
You just want to feel something.
I just want to feel something. Yeah. I want to like, do you see me? Like, what is going on here? And I want to, I remember when I was living in Asia in different countries, and it's a whole different feeling because when I walk down the street in Asia, I feel simultaneously invisible and understood both at the same time. Like, it's probably how white people feel in white countries, you know, like you're just doing your thing, you know? And
that's how white people feel in America.
You know, when I walk outside here in Berlin, I get a lot of these looks sometimes, just people staring at me. They look at me up and down.
Oh no.
This kind of look that even when I look back at them, there's not like being aware of like, oh, sorry, I was staring, like it was a bit impolite. And that's fine. We all look at people, but then they don't even acknowledge or feel like this is what it feels like. It feels
valid though.
It feels like I'm just an animal or a dog or something inferior, that there's no you know, like if I look at a dog and a dog looks back at me, I'm not going to look away. I don't have a problem. It's like, oh, you know, like this kind of social awkwardness. But these people, like,
right.
And it wasn't like one or two. It was like one after the other. Until a point, I was just looking like, what the fuck are you looking at? And they'll pretend you know, but it drives me nuts. And, you know, it's something that people don't seem to understand, the level of absurdity and rudeness.
It's like they're looking at you as some sort of like item in the store. Like, you're being objectified. I don't know if that's the right term, but they're seeing you as some sort of like foreign object.
Right. Like they don't...
like a foreigner.
Yeah. And there's, you know, and all these combinations of things, right? Like perpetual foreigners, model minority issues.
Yeah.
And
so many layers to that. It's exhausting.
It's completely exhausting. I'm so exhausted, and sometimes I just have to like think about like, it's like, do I want to put up with this today? You know, and if I go to, and it's awful because for me, I don't know if you had these kind of experiences, because I grew up in Australia and, you know, in the state of Queensland, which is kind of like Texas. You know, there are just places and situations that I just don't feel comfortable. Even the other day, I went to 2 small house gatherings. In one gathering, it was all white, and the other one, it was more mixed. And the one that was more racialized and more diverse, I realized I was so relaxed. I was so chilled. I didn't really... Whereas the white setting, I was like constant. Even though they were friendly and we knew each other, you know, but like, it's like...
There's still like that unspoken discomfort.
Yeah. And
I feel you.
I'll give you this one example of a conversation. And this person, you know, bless her, I have no animosity. And she said she had a kind of a weird thing about asking me questions. And I think this is what often happens too. Like people don't know what to say to us, don't know what to ask, or...
Right.
And I even wonder if like that's kind of what's going on with like all of these atrocities. It's like maybe there's no education for people knowing like, hey, if somebody's hurt, or, you know, like on a racial systemic level, how do you approach it? How do you like, hey, you know, simple things like, how are you? How do you feel today? You know, has it been like, and not to have, you don't have to assume anything, but just checking in, right? Like, I wonder if it's fear or just not knowing. But then we ask further, and I say, well, you know, I'll ask you a question like, how has it for you to live in this city? You know, you've been here for 2-3 years. She moved from another country as well, from another white country. But she said, well, that's a good question, right? And she said, well, you know, I think it's tough and there's difficulties. And then she kind of like took it for a spin, like, oh, so how do you feel living in this country? I say, well, yeah, it's plus and minuses. There's a lot of frustrations too for me, and it's super difficult on all these different levels. And I broke it down, and she just said, oh, wow, I just thought that you didn't have any of these issues. I was like, what do you mean? Like, she's like, well, you just seem to be, you know, you worked in fashion, you worked in advertising, you seem to be rich, and you don't have issues like us. And I'm like us, like, what?
Wait,
you know,
what?
Right? Like, I'm not human. I'm not, you know, like,
right.
Do I look like I was born with a silver spoon? Like, I have problems too, you know? And again, this is not an attack on this person personally, but it's more like, for me, it's so revealing and reflective of that kind of sentiment that I think happens a lot more. And I realize this, like,
Right.
it's crazy because this, just even on this kind of simple thing of either being hated or being fetishized, it's kind of the same coin, which is that
It is.
we're still othered. And I used to
Exactly.
think being an Asian man, the frustration of being emasculated, I used to think like, oh, if it would be better if you were fetishized or if you were seen as some desirable thing. But then I experienced both sides, and then I realized, wow, they're the same thing. It's equally horrible.
Because it all stems from racism.
Yeah, it's still that. It's still this whole othering.
It's the same issue, just different symptoms. Just the same feeling. Yeah, I definitely feel you on that.
What's it like being single for 9 years?
Oh, I love it. I love it. I love not having like rules and love meeting new people, and I like not feeling tied down. And I think, you know, in my life right now, it's funny that we're talking about relationships, because I was saying to myself, like, I think I could be ready to have a relationship with someone, like a serious one. You know, I think I've matured a lot over the past 10 years, and I've experienced a lot of life, and I know that I could use a companion right now, a partner. This singleness has really allowed me to find myself. And I'm not done finding myself. I think that'll always be a journey, your lifelong journey, but I've definitely come a long way, and I've learned how to merge all of my identities together, and it's really made me more whole. And because of that, I feel like I'm ready to meet someone and share that sort of experience with someone. But we'll see what happens. I mean, I'm not like actively pursuing anybody. I really enjoy being alone. I love enjoying, you know, time with my closest friends. And given this pandemic too, it's really difficult to meet people. I mean, how does one go on dates anymore? I mean, I don't know. It's still so risky.
What's your experience when it comes to race and relationships?
Yeah, well, I mean, going back to your conversation earlier about how you were in two different settings, like one was a more diverse group and one was a more like predominantly white group, and how you felt this sort of unease, it's very real. And I think it's every person of color feels that way in a group of predominantly white people. It's this sort of like unspoken tension, this need to perform, to be liked, or truly not give a fuck. Whatever the path you decide to choose at that very moment. But yeah, I definitely have experienced that myself at the workplace. I always feel like in companies, corporate agencies, or any sort of work setting, I've always felt like I was not really respected or taken seriously. My words didn't matter. I was just a machine here to do work, day in, day out, produce results, bring the numbers. But no one ever asked me how I was doing, or checking in on me, or asking me if there's anything that they could improve on. Of course, they're not going to ask my opinion on that. So yeah, there's a lot of issues in the workplace, not only just diversity and inclusion, but also really just uplifting and caring about people of color in the workplace. It's one thing to be a diverse company, but it's another thing to really have like a very uplifting environment.
You know, I would say New York City is a very diverse place, but it's not at all a place where people actually stand on even ground.
No, not at all. Not at all. It's very unfair. It's very uneven, this playing field, which is why I think, going back to our first topic in this interview, I think, which the topic of social climbing comes into play, because I felt I was being taken advantage of, or I was on a different playing field, on a different level, on the low end. I always had to like climb the ladder by being more funny, by being more appealing in some way. I've always had to like up one someone else. That's the workplace. You're always going to come across issues like this in any workplace. But my hope is that people are more aware and unafraid to speak up when they feel the playing field's uneven.
I mean, it depends on their safety. Social climbing gets a bad rap. I think it's too easy to just shut it down. And I think it's usually people that have certain level of comfort that would criticize, right? Like if you're within the city gates, of course you would look down on the people that is fighting and crawling to try and get within the city gates even. But if you're poor, why wouldn't you want to climb? Because your conditions are so terrible. It's more of an issue when you step on the people that are helping you in life or gotten you somewhere, and you realize you can't go further unless you step on them to get further ahead, to get access to some resource, to the light, what have you not. I think it's time to have these conversations with one another and learning how to share things and how to discuss things more openly. But yeah, it's so tricky within the world of fashion or capitalism in general.
Yeah, we're all learning every day. Some companies are trying. Some people are actually trying. They're learning, they're compiling resources, they're trying to create and promote this very diverse atmosphere. There's a lot of initiatives happening. Things are changing, but it's going to take a long time. We have generations and generations to unlearn. It's not going to happen in a year. We just have to continue talking about these things. And I'm actually really glad that, I'm not happy about the hate crimes, but I'm really glad that it's brought into further conversation about racism and a different sphere of racism, different perspective from the Asian community, and how we've been often dismissed. Oh, you're too sensitive. That wasn't racism. Just always being gaslit.
According to Wikipedia, gaslighting is a form of psychological manipulation in which a person or group sows seed of doubt in a target individual or group, making them question their own memory, perception, or judgment. Using denial, misdirection, contradiction, and misinformation, gaslighting involves attempts to destabilize the victim and delegitimize the victim's belief. As I speak to more and more people about their experience on racism, I observe this phenomenon quite frequently. It often causes us to question our own stances on race and racism, forcing us to question our response to racism versus the racism itself. Racism as a whole, for Asian in diaspora, experiences the denial of their experience. The mainstream society often invalidates our experience and undermines what we know about our own race. It establishes racial hierarchies in society and drains our mental energy.
Right. Asians are gaslit for their existence. Always dismissed.
Gaslighting is such a difficult and subtle issue to address. I also have to pick my battles. It's the subtle covert racism that is really hard to notice and to speak about. It's just all very exhausting. You mentioned confronting people in situations instead of letting things slide. I realized that I haven't been able to always tell people the truth in these moments and situations, especially with those close to me. It's almost too close for me to share my vulnerability because it hurts so much. I close up like a kind of self-protection mechanism. It's much easier to speak against the violence of strangers.
Right.
But with close friends that mean a lot to me, it gets even more difficult.
No, I feel you 100%. It's so difficult to approach your closest friends on these heavy issues, heavy topics, especially when you're trying to be vulnerable and you really need help and you really need to be heard. It's really hard to say something when you're Asian, to allow yourself to be emotionally vulnerable, because we were taught as a community to ignore and dismiss our emotions because that won't get us through to the top. We were just taught to shut up and work and produce results. So yeah, I feel you. I mean, even with my close friends, I have a group text of like 6 or 7 of my close friends. And I was like, I'm struggling here. I'm really mad. I'm really sad. I don't know what to say. And I'm really struggling to find the words, but this is how I feel. And I really need y'all to say something because this isn't cool. And I was there for you when you didn't ask me to, and I wouldn't be asking if it wasn't urgent. So please help me. I'm really glad I did, because there was overall sense of community and unity from that message. I just felt like I needed to say something, otherwise nothing would have been shared.
Yeah, I just realized how hard it is for me too. Hearing that, I think, like imagining myself saying that same thing, and it seems so simple. Like I want to consider myself as a communicative adult, but then I realized that I haven't really done that too many times in my life, very rarely. And it's been in really extreme circumstances. And right now, just imagining saying that seems so, it's crazy how I don't have the training for it. I don't have the experience.
I mean, no one really has training for it. You just have to allow yourself to be vulnerable and be okay with that. And if they are your friends, they will lift you up. It'll just make your relationship with your friends stronger, if anything. There's definitely a generational, this racial trauma when it comes to speaking up, especially in the Asian community. I was on Instagram and I was just listening to all the news, and these elderly Asian folks, when bad things happen to those people, they don't say anything. They just go home and they just process, but they don't want to go to the officials. They don't want to speak up about what happened. They just accept it. But that in our generation, we wouldn't let that fly. We would cause a ruckus. We would cause chaos. So I think that's something, as a minority group, that's a trauma that we're trying to heal, is this feeling of constant gaslighting and constant dismissal and not being able to speak up when you should, and constantly doubting yourself for just being you. That's a sickness. That's a sickness in our community that needs to be tended to. And the healing has started. It's going to hurt.
So I was reflecting back on these news headlines, particularly the framing of these stories and events. There seems to be a point of view around that it's an issue for the Asian elderly. Though I suspect there's a larger issue and problem that's completely missed here. That it's actually an issue around the hatred of Asians as a whole.
Right.
Yes, the elderly has been attacked and they're vulnerable, but that's just what's been reported to get your attention on the media. There's been so much violence across the board that doesn't get the same sympathy and traction, but are equally violent and disturbing. For example, there was a young Asian man who suffered from mental illness who was shot to death by a police officer despite having his hands raised and he had no weapon. Where is the commotion over this murder? I remember when Asians would get attacked, even pre-pandemic, it was so common to gaslight the experience, and we say, oh well, the person was nerdy, vulnerable, they look like a target. Maybe it's the way they carry themselves. But hold on, why do we blame the victim for the violence? There's still such an issue when it comes to the whole anti-Asian hate crime.
Right.
That we seem to speak about helping the needy. This isn't an issue of just about the vulnerable class of society. This is a larger issue at hand. That's the issue of racism. And you're right about the model minority issue. We're not used to speaking up and sharing our pains and being vulnerable.
Yeah, I agree. It's the question is not of not being able to protect our elders is not the issue. It's we need to protect Asian people. It's a matter of race, not a matter of age. The crimes against these elderly Asian people, it's really, really sad. And they were the most vulnerable ones that day. Just so happens to be that it happened and they were targeted. But I have a feeling if it was any other race, I don't know if that would have happened. By Kathy Park Hong. Are you familiar with this author?
Yes, this was the most important book I read from 2020.
There's this quote here. I'm trying to pull it up on my end. She says, "This country insists that our racial identity is beside the point, that it has nothing to do with being bullied or passed over for promotion or cut off every time we talk. Our race has nothing to do with this country, even, which is why we're often listed as, quote, other in polls and why we're hard to find in racial breakdowns on reported rape or workplace discrimination or domestic abuse. It's like being ghosted, I suppose, where deprived of all social cues, I have no relational gauge for my own behavior. I ransack my mind for what I could have done, could have said. I stop trusting what I see, what I hear. My ego is in free fall while my superego is boundless, railing that my existence is not enough, never enough. So I become compulsive in my efforts to do better, be better, blindly following this country's gospel of self-interest, proving my individual worth by expanding my net worth until I vanish." That quote just makes me want to scream.
I want to cry.
I just feel like being Asian in America, people don't really care until you say something to them, and then maybe they'll decide to care.
I noticed in a conversation with a younger friend the other day, it was interesting because at first he asked me, have I done anything or said anything in our interactions that was offensive to you? Basically asking, was I racist? Have I done anything racist? I said no. And then later on in bed, I realized I was just trying to make him comfortable, and that I didn't feel comfortable or safe to believe that he could take it or that he could understand, or that doesn't even matter. I couldn't speak the truth, and it was hurting both of us. And so I texted him back and I said that I wasn't truthful to you. And somehow I was still trying to pad it, trying to make it easy to digest and being very pleasant. This person then went on to reflect and share some of those reflections with me and some form of self-criticism. But then I also realized that this person actually had no clue and still has no clue in the sense of what he thought could have potentially been racist or offensive or upsetting were the most non-issues. Or it's more the fact that he thought that they were an issue that makes me question and think, I think you have other issues.
Right. Lack of education, lack of awareness.
Yeah. And how could he, you know, it's not his fault. People like me never say anything to him. Like, he has to sit there in the dark and invent this stuff and guess, I've been getting into attempting terribly at trying to create memes these days. My lockdown projects.
I've been seeing those. It's so fun.
And the Sex and the City one, it just hit me. I just thought like this whole situation where Miranda was with this guy and he doesn't actually have any clue about sex or her orgasm or female anatomy, but then she's been faking her orgasms all this time. So finally she confronted him and he was kind of just confused. It's like, no, but of course I know. I realized like this is what it feels like. And now I feel like, oh, I'm pulling a Miranda. I'm faking an orgasm. I'm not telling the truth, like people are upsetting me all the time. And I'm like, oh yeah, it's fine. Yeah, great.
All of my friends that are people of color, we banter and joke about race all the time. And we have this common understanding of history, our culture and background. So we have this sort of openness to be able to talk about it and talk about our frustrations, and we all get it. But when it comes to talking about race with white friends or white people, it's so difficult. First of all, when it comes to talking about race with white people, I just feel so exhausted. I don't want to spend any more energy on it than I have to, because I yell every day on Instagram. But I also feel like if I don't say something, then who's going to say it? And who's going to educate these people? Like, there's not a class they take in high school called Racial Awareness 101. Like, I wish there was. Hell, I would have taken that class, just to be more aware. It would have saved me a lot of trouble growing up. But yeah, I feel you. I give you kudos for being able to speak up to your friend, because I know that I probably wouldn't have, as not to cause any commotion. But there have been many times where I feel like my closest friends, my closest white friends, it's been so difficult to talk about racism. And sometimes they'll say something or act or joke about something that has them kind of like a minor Asian microaggression. And inside I'm like cringing, but I'm smiling like and shaking my head in nod of approval just to have the conversation going, like to change the subject real quick. But in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, oh God, that was really bad. I should have said something. And then I'll push it to the side. I'll push that thought away and be like, okay, I'll confront him or her about it later. But I never do.
When it comes to inclusivity or diversity placements, this horrible thing about like putting people in because it's the flavor of the month. I find that so horribly upsetting. I'm deeply afraid of virtue signaling. I find it so difficult because there's no real relationships being made and being maintained, because people are kind of having to keep up with the latest virtues to signal. As long as the virtues keep changing, I think that's when people have to keep updating and dropping and picking up new things to amplify to the outside world. I like what you said about keeping track and being aware of what people's actions are during this time. As a comparison, like I also kept mental notes of, and this is where it's upsetting, where, okay, I'm not saying that everybody has to go and post things on social media or say certain things and toot certain horns, but it is interesting to see of which people during Black Lives Matter said certain things, and only during the peak of Black Lives Matter versus before and after as a comparison, right?
Right, right.
It's like reading body languages or anything like that. Like it's not like if somebody crosses their arms, it means that they're feeling defensive. You need to have a baseline and then you compare. And this comparisons for me does not show very positive things in people's behavior and what's going on internally.
The more that I think about it, I just get so upset. Like, I get that we're all exhausted from this pandemic. Okay, like that's probably the biggest stress right now for me personally is this pandemic, and just staying focused and just keeping up with my daily routine and focusing on my mental health. That's like my number one priority. So I get it for other people too. Okay, like sometimes you need to withdraw and disconnect. The second thing is just like, I get that we all have like a limited bandwidth when it comes to racism, but it's really, really telling and surprising to see someone who's so outspoken and vocal about racial tensions and racial disparities in the Black community. But when it came down to anti-Asian sentiments, not a peep, just silence. And I don't know if that's something I should keep confronting, or there's this Korean influencer, beauty influencer, skin guru. His name is David Yi, otherwise on Instagram, Socialite, like Seoul, like in Korea. Love the spelling. He's been challenging a lot of beauty companies and skincare companies to speak up and speak out against discrimination against Asian people and the injustices that are happening in our community. And it's like sort of a challenge to see like who's going to actually say something. And not a lot of companies have stepped forward, and not just the ones that he was mentioning or tagging, but just in general. Where's a sort of passion and the sort of like acknowledgement that these things are even happening? Where is an Instagram post with like a 5-slide carousel stating like your initiatives and how you're going to do better? Where is that now? Y'all were so busy to post about D&I efforts in the workplace. We were so fast to post about how you're going to do better, including more Black-owned products, beauty products, Black designers, which is great. And I think it's very necessary. Also, what about all of the Asian beauty products, the Asian designers? Where are their highlights? Why aren't we amplifying their stories? Now is the time. You want to talk about D&I, amplify those stories. I think you said it well, like people don't know how to act or how to be after something like this happens. Maybe people are just afraid to make the wrong move. You know, if you make the wrong move, that's bad. If you don't make a move, that's bad. How do people navigate this? And that's even a question for me too. I'm like, how does one navigate this sort of awakening? Everyone's starting to be more aware, hyper aware of racial tensions and the racial disparities in all the communities, and people are getting exhausted. How do we continue the conversation without getting people exhausted? And how can this be a part of our lives every day and in the workplace and in our communities? That's a bigger question at hand.
Yeah, I think these are such important questions. I think we are so used to having answers, but once we actually reach profound questions, there's no real answer. I think it's more about reconfiguring the questions and then being able to admit that we don't know. I realized in my own conversations and confrontations with people, it's like people will say, well, I don't know what to say. And I said, well, that's a good start.
Yeah, at least you're admitting that you just don't know.
Yeah.
It's not like you don't want to help. It sounds like they want to help, but they don't know what to say.
Like even that's a good start. Like I want to help. I don't know what to say. I don't know what to do.
Right. There's like a sense of humanness.
Yeah.
You know, this will always be a journey. This is a long road ahead. I mean, we're not going to find answers and solutions. We're not going to see reparations because there's so much of our generation that needs to be unpacked. I mean, even within the Asian community, I don't know everything, the history.
I'm learning things every day.
You know,
I'm Asian.
Oh my gosh, me too.
Like, what?
I mean, I like YouTube. I went on YouTube the other day and I typed in like the history of Korea and the tensions between Japan and Korea. Like, I don't know the full story and the dates.
There's a lot.
And the who's and what's of like, there's a lot of material there. And, you know, all the different laws that banned Asian immigrants to come here to America. Like, there's just so much material that even me, I'm still learning, and I'm grateful for that. You know, I'm not a know-it-all. I don't know everything. now I can understand why someone would not want to, but where this sort of unspoken trauma comes from. I want to unearth this trauma. That's what I'm researching. Where is this pain coming from?
I noticed with the lockdown that there are the groups of people that are put in a situation where they can't do business as usual. And then there are the groups that are a bit more protected or insulated that could still carry on a bit more of business as usual with some new limitations. But it is interesting to see those who are having this difficulty, but then having so much new time for contemplation and research. And I think this is quite an interesting historical moment where people are just having that ability to pause. Like, I feel like we were on this mad acceleration. Nobody really had time to think. I realized that I didn't even really sleep before COVID, I feel like. I feel like COVID brought some kind of sleep. Mental health is also very important for me, especially in this period. Like, I know exactly what you're saying. Like, if I don't have my mental health, how the hell can I do anything in my days?
Do you have like a morning or night routine?
I have aspirations, and some days I do better than others, and that's also okay. For me, it's more about the awareness of these things, and I try to bring in my breathing meditations and some exercises for some clarity or focus or relaxation. But I'm also human, and there's all kinds of stressors that come and surprises in different days. I always love that saying. Is it from Mike Tyson? Everybody's got a plan until you get punched in the face.
This kind of segues into another topic that I find interesting, is just mental health within the Asian community, how we approach that. I feel like not a lot of, like, I know that my parents would never want to go to the doctor. My parents are like, oh, just stay at home. We have all these herbs. We have different like homeopathic medicines, and like we have our...
I'm still like that.
Friends who are practitioners will never go to a doctor or surgery or ER or anything like that. And I'm like, okay, well,
let alone mental health.
Yeah, but when it comes to mental health, like, they're like, oh, it's not a mental health disorder. You just need to, let's just slap it out of you or something. It's just very like black and white to them.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's no such thing as mental health in the Asian community.
No.
Up until now.
That's a Western myth.
And again, that kind of goes back to the model minority myth, how our emotions have always been dismissed, undervalued. We've always been gaslit. So we were taught to sort of internalize all these emotions and not being able to project them and be validated for them. So we have this sort of like generational resentful trauma against ourselves and other people for inciting that sort of pain onto us. And we're now dealing with the consequences of not going to therapy. Like, we need a generational racial therapy course for all of us Asian people.
I also have a fear of talking not only to white people, but also Asians. If this is going to be an Asian that is willing to listen, or is this an Asian that's going to also gaslight me?
Yeah.
Because of their own trauma or inability to face their own issues, or deny my own experiences.
That's another conversation for another podcast. Asian people who never bring up racism or who don't have issues with it. That's a whole another set of traumas that needs to be unveiled.
Kevin Chung is an Asian American living and working in New York City. He's the founder of Kev Management, a PR, talent, and artist management company with a focus on diversity and inclusion. You can connect with Kevin at Kevin K. Chung or at Kev_MGMT on Instagram. Kevin read from the seminal book Minor Feelings, An Asian American Reckoning by Kathy Park Hong. News footage exclusive by Sefan Kim on ABC Channel 7. Asian Provocation is a queer conversational podcast sharing invisible ideas and stories with a focus on Asian diaspora. Learn more about the stories as well as other information on cinema, books, ideas on our website, asianprovocation.com. Asian Provocation is produced by yours truly, Ayota Taraxia. Music by August Williamson, Ebb and Flood, From Now On, and Jay Vartan. Special thanks to Liv Phoenix and Adam Ridgway. You can find all the links, videos, and show notes on the website, again at asianprovocation.com. This is an independent listener-supported podcast. You can donate one time, as well as a monthly support on patreon.com. You can tweet me at ap_pod or connect on Instagram at asian.provocation. On next week's episode, we're joined by Akane Emeka Maduka, in Canada, a Nigerian-born artist, and we speak about her experiences and about her art.